How delightful! Mountain wellings so solitary and tranquil. Because of this, I always read the Lotus Blossom Sutra. Wholehearted vigor under trees. What is there to love or hate? How enviable! Sound of evening rains in deep autumn. Well, it's spring, not autumn, but that verse was one of the final poems from Dogen, the father of our Soto school. And it was written in the remote mountains at Eiheiji Temple. Some of us have been there. And I was inspired by Roshi Gyoku again. He had mentioned visions of awakening space and time, Dogen and the Lotus Sutra by Taigen Dan Leighton. So I just got that the other day, and I'm already enjoying it very much. But it makes, another tie with the Lotus Sutra. Dogen was very fond of the Lotus Sutra. In my research, I ran across, once again, Ryokan as well, one of my favorite poets and kind of eccentric Japanese priests, and he favors the Lotus Sutra as well. So I encourage you to be so inspired and to read. One of his famous poems, "The Thief Left It Behind, the Moon at My Window." Good evening, all you Buddhas and Bodhisattvas and Dharma treasures and Sangha treasures, And in order to keep the urgency of our practice at the forefront, I welcome you future corpses as well. Thank you for the gift of your presence on this beautiful evening in Los Angeles. And now I'd like to pause and acknowledge, pay respect, and gratitude for our Native American heritage. With our Zoom participants, we cover a lot of ground. I know Gikai and Saren are up in Northern California. Nyodo is back east. And I don't know all the indigenous tribes there, the indigenous groups. Choran, likewise, is in Brazil. I don't think she's with us tonight because of the time difference, but they certainly have an indigenous population as well. Up in San Luis Obispo, where I live, my home and the home of the San Luis Obispo Zen Circle, it's the Yakitutu Yak Tahini, or Northern Chumash people. And of course, here it's the Tongva people. So let us place our hands in Gasho and bowing, acknowledge and pay deep respect to all of our indigenous peoples, past, present, and future. I'm an avid reader of Eve Marco's blog. Eve was the co-author of the Householder koan book with Roshi Gyoku. And in a recent blog, interestingly called "Taking Off Masks," she had a quote by a man called Awad. He's a peace activist, speaking about the violence in the Middle East. Eve was stuck there because of the violence going on. All the planes had been canceled, all the flights out. She was visiting her mom and family, and she shared this. He wrote, "The violence happening in the Holy Land today, especially in and around Jerusalem, is a result of the systemic racism, fascism, and apartheid that has been building up for decades. To clearly label things as they are is not the end of the road, but the beginning of the work needed to truly heal and move forward to achieve peace and justice in this land. So our acknowledging of the indigenous groups is a first step. There's now movement afoot about reparations. Roshi Gyoku mentioned one last night. Some have already occurred. Perhaps another step will be for us to continue bearing witness. And in light of that, I'll put a plug in for the Zen Peacemakers Native American Plunge 2021, and it will be held in person. Everything up to this point has been Zooming. It will be held in the Bighorn Mountains of Wyoming. Interesting, one of the presenters is Arvel Looking Horse. He is the 19th keeper of the sacred white buffalo calf pipe. And this pipe was brought to the Lakota people many, many years ago to pray for spiritual strength. I got a little bit of a kick out of that because when I was a young boy, I was in Y&D Guides with my dad. And like we get Dharma names, you get a name when you're with that group, and my name was White Buffalo. So we're at the end of our third full day of Grow a Lotus session. How are you doing? Actually, I know how some of you are doing. I've been in mic problem. It's always something. Yeah? So this has certainly been a lotus-filled session. We've been immersed in it, huh? We've been chanting 2 chapters each day from the Lotus Sutra during the noontime service. Even the moon cooperated this week. Wednesday night was a full moon, but it wasn't just any full moon. It was the only total lunar eclipse of 2021. It was the super flower blood moon. And of course, Lotus Sutra, or the Lotus Flower Sutra. So I thought that was really quite wonderful. And it's been a powerful week, both in sesshin and events going on in the world. One thing took me aback. It was last Monday was Bob Dylan's 80th birthday. And also 1 year since the killing of George Floyd. So we're beginning to slowly lift this pandemic veil. And it's in many ways really exciting to see what's going to happen with this, our new so-called norm. What's that going to look like? There'll be some changes. What I'm most concerned about is, will we ever do Oryoki again? I so miss that. I was talking to Earth Mirror today, and he feels the exact same way. So I look forward to the day when we can be in that intimate surrounding together again as Sangha. So chapter 23, Previous Lives of Medicine King Bodhisattva. There's different titles from different translations. That's one of them. That's the Reeves translation. Burton Watson is Former Affairs of the Bodhisattva Medicine King. Another was Former Deeds of the Bodhisattva Medicine King. I'm not going to use affairs. We've got, there's a lot of baggage with that. But previous lives of the Medicine King Bodhisattva is good. And I'd like to put the chapter in perspective and kind of take a quick overview of the Lotus Sutra. The talks have been jumping around from one chapter to the next, most often not in sequence. So many scholars speak of this work being divided into two sections, and more recent times they have added a third. The first part, they say, these are the Reeves commentary, it elucidates a unifying truth of the universe, the one vehicle of the wonderful Dharma. And of course, that's the teaching of the one path, the one true path. The second part sheds light on the everlasting personal life of the Buddha. And that is that the cosmic realm, as they said, everlasting original Buddha. And the third part emphasizes the actual activities of human beings, the Bodhisattva way. So Thich Nhat Hanh takes a very similar approach, but he's very, well, of course he's a scholar as well, but he's very practice-based. And I know many of you in my talks with you have been kind of struggling with the Lotus Sutra. So the encouragement is to grab one of these commentaries. Thich Nhat Hanh's is very good. Two Buddhas sitting side by side is good. And there are others. But it really helps open up the text for you. I can remember reading this years ago, probably almost 20 years ago, and it was kind of, what? And now, taking the time to really dive into it, look at multiple translations and multiple commentaries, it's really opened up. So Thich Nhat Hanh kind of goes along with this same, the three divisions as well. The historical dimension that we've talked about a lot, this historical Shakyamuni Buddha. The second section, which begins with chapter 11, the treasure stupa that I talked to a few weeks ago, arising out of the ground, out of the earth, gets us into the ultimate dimension through chapter 22. And chapter 22 is kind of the end of that piece, and that's when the treasure stupa goes back into the earth. The Buddha has told all the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas from all these distant realms to go home. They had offered to take on the teaching for him. And he said, we've got our own group here, and brings up all these Buddhas and Bodhisattvas from the earth. That was chapter 15, which Sensei Faithbind had spoken about. And the third section, which are chapters 23 to 28, are what Thich Nhat Hanh calls opening the doors of action. So this chapter, chapter 23, would be part of this opening the doors of action. Now, scholars think that these were tagged onto the Lotus Sutra at some point after many of the other chapters were done, and weren't really part of the original. Likewise, as Roshi mentioned again last night, chapter 12, Devadatta, that she did, likewise looks like it was a later addition. And interestingly, the first chapter was put in later to try to tie in the two sections of the Lotus Sutra. So it was certainly a work in progress for a long time. So Thich Nhat Hanh is very much an activist. Roshi Glassman, Bernie, was certainly an activist. And all these various bodhisattvas that were introduced to are activists. And they epitomize the various active qualities we need to manifest to live in this historical / ultimate world, right here in our Saha world. So, this is about us. you and me. It's our lives. And we, you and I, have these two halves. I'm Mark Kizan Shogun Bloodgood, born October 9th, 1949, and I will expire or extinguish at some time in the future my historic self. And as my dad often said, I have more years behind me than I have ahead of me. And yet, of course, he said that when he was 65 or 60, maybe early 60s, and he lived to 94. So had he lived to 120 like Joshu, he couldn't have said that. But we also have this ultimate life besides this skin bag. And our practice is to realize and bring into focus this ultimate life. Our practice to uncover our ultimate lives and then to integrate them. But they're not two. I had a question this morning, this afternoon, and it was so similar to a question Norman Fisher had received. I listened to one of his talks. And the student said, when we vow to save all beings, is the idea that there'll be a day when suffering ends? And she said to Norman, it's just a yes or no question. Well, he responded saying, it's not a yes or no question. Buddhism does give us a hopeful future. The Lotus Sutra is implying, though, that these questions don't make any sense at all because they're coming from a linear space, a linear point in time. And there's giant contradictions that you can probably see in the Lotus Sutra that our thinking mind would think were contradictions. So he said, maybe yes and no. Yes and no, but not yes or no. You cannot answer the question. We'll never stop asking the question until we figure it out, which we never will. We'll never figure it out. And yet in practice, we see through the eye of practice how true is this paradoxical vision of the Lotus Sutra. We see with our six senses, this was Norman speaking, we see with our six senses, but also see that this truth is the best way to sustain our life of caring and loving one another, and to have a genuine, unshakable conviction about a hopeful future, even though bad things happen. In this same exchange with this student, the student said she's reading Ben Ehrenreich, and I'm sure that Earthmere knows about him. And the book she was referring to was called Desert Notebooks, a roadmap for the end of time. So basically he's saying our human, and of course he's an environmentalist worried about climate change. He says our human idea of progress, how we think that for eons we have taken the road from primitive infancy to rational civilization, and that we have to continue this path. And that's our phenomenal world. Isn't that how most of us think? He says, we didn't see that the path we were on would lead us here into this cul-de-sac. And now the asphalt is melting and falling away beneath our feet. And he's meaning that the planet is burning up. We have no choice but to scramble, to retrace our steps, and try, in a hurry now, to manage things differently. Other worlds, other ways of thinking, living, seeing, other ways of writing and reading. He said, we need all the help we can get to become something else. And in some ways, it's wonderful, as I reflect on that that's what we're doing when we're reading the Lotus Sutra and in our practice. And like our practice, there's a sense of urgency. Do not waste your time by night or day. So these 3 chapters, 23, 24, and 25, are about different bodhisattvas. The chapter 23, Previous Lives of Medicine King Bodhisattva. Chapter 24, Wonderful Voice Bodhisattva, or Wonderful Sound Bodhisattva. Chapter 25, The Universal Gateway of the Bodhisattva, Regarder of the Cries of the World. And that's Avalokitesvara, so well known to most of us. So all these bodhisattvas in these 3 chapters and in other chapters emphasize the qualities we should be, we, you and I, we should be developing. Roshi spoke of Devadatta last night. Inclusivity. Never disparaging Buddha, reminding us of our inherent Buddha nature and future Buddhahood. Now, all of these Buddhas in chapters 23, 24, and 5 have a special power. Due to their severe and arduous practices, they developed a special concentration. And this is the concentration of manifesting in various forms. And we've heard about this with Avalokitesvara, doing what needs to be done given the situation. Now, references to the Medicine King are peppered throughout the Lotus Sutra. He's listed in the Sutra of Innumerable Meanings, which is the sutra before the Lotus Sutra, and then listed again as a bodhisattva in chapter 1 and various places throughout the text. He's especially noteworthy and one of the predominant characters in chapter 10, Teachers of the Dharma. He doesn't really get a word in edgewise there because it's Buddha speaking to him. Now, Norman Fisher doesn't really like this chapter. He says it creeps him out. And if you haven't read it, you'll soon see why he feels that way. The chapter begins, at that time, the Bodhisattva constellation Kingflower said to the Buddha, "World-honored one, why does Medicine King Bodhisattva travel around this world?" World-honored one, Medicine King Bodhisattva has done hundreds of thousands of billions of difficult and painful practices. World-honored one, I beg you, please explain it a little. And in the chapter, that's what the Buddha does. And the chapter's actually in 2 sections. The first part is the story or the plot line. And this is Buddha telling a few of the Medicine King's prior lives. And then the second half is extolling the virtues of sharing this chapter and the Lotus Sutra with others. And unlike many of the chapters, there's no verse in like the second half. It reads mostly in prose. So the players, of course, Medicine King Bodhisattva, and that's who the Buddha is talking about. And Another player is the Buddha, pure and bright excellence of sun and moon. And I won't even try to actually pronounce his name. It's 27 characters. But the medicine king, Bodhisattva, was his student in a past life. Seen with joy by all living beings, Bodhisattva. That's only 24 characters in his name. But again, I'm not going to try to pronounce it. So this was the medicine king, Bodhisattva, in a prior life. And he was a student. And he had a great devotion and love of his teacher, the teacher who shared the Lotus Sutra with him. Now, there's a side note. It was really interesting that this name of the Bodhisattva, joy by all living beings, seen with joy by all living beings, Bodhisattva, was the same name predicted as the Buddha name for Mahapajapati. Well, that's the Buddha's stepmom, aunt, who raised him, and the first Buddhist nun. So maybe this Bodhisattva in the past life is conflated with her life. And maybe this is some consolation, given the misogyny manifesting in the culture of that era, which I dare say has many tentacles that reach into our era. So in this case, it's Norman Fisher again. When he speaks of seen with joy by all living beings, Bodhisattva, he says she, the feminine. Isn't that interesting? So the Buddha says we've got this past Bodhisattva, and she is training arduously and doing quite well, and has a real passion for the teacher, an admiration, a dedication. And so she pays homage to him, doing all sorts of wonderful things. And you've certainly read about many of those in the Lotus Sutra, all the flowers and incense and all that they do. But then thought later that I want to do more for my teacher. And she says, though I have made offerings to the Buddha with my divine powers, that is not as good as offering my body. So, she or he decides to sacrifice the body and sets fire to his own body. The text says the light illuminated worlds as numerous as the Ganges, as the sands of 8 billion Ganges. The Buddhas in those lands all praised him at the same time, saying, well done, well done. This is true devotion. So the fire, he or she, burns for 1,200 years before it burns itself out. And then there's a rebirth. And the rebirth, he's born into the land of pure and bright excellence of sun and moon Buddha, in the house of King Pure Virtue. I love these names. And he's born suddenly by transformation, sitting cross-legged, not a womb birth, but by transformation. Now, as I said, he is still in this world or the teacher from his past life is still here. The Buddha, pure and bright excellence of sun and moon. So of course he reconnects. And this time does the same thing, paying homage and celebrating the time together, studying together. And then this Buddha says, it's time for my extinction. I'm going on to nirvana. Basically, I want you to take the reins and keep the movement, the studying going. Take care of the Lotus Sutra. Carry it forward. So, once again, seen with joy by all living bodhisattvas, thought to himself, I want to make offerings. Makes a lot of offerings. Once again says, I'm still not satisfied. So he burns his arms, burns them off. Now his students think that that's kind of gross to see this teacher without any arms. And he's so pure, of course, the arms grow back. And the Buddha says to Constellation King Flower Bodhisattva, who he's been speaking to and explaining the past lives, what do you think? Is seen with joy by all the living bodhisattva some unknown foreigner? No. He is the present Medicine King Bodhisattva. Now this immolation it's interesting. Some of you are old enough to remember the Vietnam War and the monks who immolated themselves in the 60s. I can still remember vividly the picture of Thich Quang Duc immolating himself in Saigon. Thich Nhat Hanh actually knew him personally and had spent time with him. So Thich Quang wanted the world to become aware of the persecution of Buddhists in Vietnam. The president then, who was a Catholic, had banned the celebration of the Buddha's birthday. Now, Christmas was a national holiday, but it was in a country where 90% of the population practiced Buddhism. But they were forbidden to celebrate. There was another nun, Nat Chi Mai, which means one branch of plum. Isn't that interesting? She was Thich Nhat Hanh's disciple, one of the first 6 members of the original order of interbeing in Vietnam. She immolated herself in order to call for the cessation of the hostilities between the North and the South. So this practice has its roots in the Lotus Sutra. Now, the Lotus Sutra says, because they had realized the insight into their ultimate nature and were no longer attached to an idea of the physical body as the self, the monks were free to use their bodies to deliver a powerful message. And that's actually Thich Nhat Hanh, not the Lotus Sutra. That's pretty heavy stuff. Many people asked Thich Nhat Hanh, isn't such an act a violation of the Buddhist precept of non-killing? He wrote to Martin Luther King Jr. a letter explaining that the monk's act was not suicide. A suicidal person is someone who is overwhelmed by despair that they don't want to live anymore. I knew that Thich Quang Duc loved life and wished only for his friends and all living beings to be able to live in peace. So we have in Buddhism, we have, I think, when I think of the burning of the arms, what came up for me was Bodhidharma's first heir, who cut off his arm to show sincerity. Wow. And the Jataka tale about Shakyamuni Buddha in a previous life. In it, Shakyamuni Buddha is a Brahmin searching for enlightenment. He saw a mother tiger who was weak and unable to hunt and care for her tiger cubs. Seeing that the tiger mom was forced to eat one of her children just to provide for the other cubs, Shakyamuni decided he would sacrifice his own life to feed the tiger. Well, what's this mean to us? Nobody's asking you to go out and set yourself on fire, certainly. But just as the practice of the never discouraging Bodhisattva had a specific function to remind people of their Buddha nature and potential Buddhahood, Medicine King represents another aspect, the practice of devotion, dedication, and love. You know, there's bodhisattvas even among us. Right here in this room. Many that are alive today. On another recommendation of Roshi Gyoku, I read Brian Stevenson's book, Just Mercy, a story of justice and redemption. And you may have heard of him. He's on the book cover, it even says, one of the most brilliant and influential lawyers of our time. He's an American lawyer, a social justice activist, and founder executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative, EJI, based in Montgomery, Alabama. He has done so much work for inmates on death row who couldn't otherwise have legal counsel. And he's worked with children who are incarcerated at very young ages, charged as adults, serving life sentences. And often these are in unimaginable circumstances where they're being beaten and raped. So he tells a story in that book. He's in a small African-American church in rural Alabama, and he notices it's a very small group, I think a dozen people, and he notices this African-American in the back sitting in a wheelchair. And throughout the presentation, he shows no emotion or reaction. So Brian said his focused stare was unnerving. So following the talk, people come up and they pay their respects and express their appreciation. Everybody had left, and the young boy who was with this gentleman takes his wheelchair and brings it down to Brian. He stopped in front of me, leaned forward in his wheelchair, and said forcefully, "Do you know what you're doing?" And he looked very serious, and he wasn't smiling. I couldn't really tell what he was asking, Brian said, or whether he was hostile. But he said it again, "Do you know what you're doing?" Brian tried to smile to kind of diffuse things, but was pretty stifled. And then this man cuts him off and says loudly, "I'll tell you what you're doing. You're beating the drum for justice." He said it again. "You've got to beat the drum for justice." So at this point, he leans forward again and says, "You've got to keep beating the drum for justice. And said it once again. So he leans back, tired, out of breath. He waves Brian closer. He's tired, seems weak. He pulls Brian by the arm and leans forward, speaking quietly, almost in a whisper, but with a fierceness that Brian says was unforgettable. You see this scar on the top of my head? I got that scar in Greene County, Alabama, trying to register to vote in 1964. You see this scar on the side of my head? He turns his head to the left. There was a 4-inch scar just about his right ear. I got that scar in Mississippi, demanding civil rights. His voice grew stronger. He tightened the grip on Brian's arm. And he said, lowering his head, you see that mark? There was a dark circle at the base of his skull. I got that bruise in Birmingham after the Children's Crusade. People think these are my scars, cuts and bruises, he said. Brian notices that there's tears welling up now. He placed his hands on his head. These aren't my scars, cuts, and bruises. These are my medals of honor. Brian said that he stared at Brian for a long time, wiped his eyes, nodded to the boy, and wheeled him away. Brian said that I stood there with a lump in my throat, staring after him. After a moment, I realized that the time to open the Alabama office had come. So what scars, cuts, and bruises do you carry? Are they internal, perhaps, rather than outside? And do you consider them your scars, cuts, and bruises? Or do you consider them your medals? And back to our chapter and devotion and speaking of affection. Thich Nhat Hanh said, you might wonder how devotion and affection are part of the practice of looking deeply and attaining enlightenment. Do we need to love our teacher? Do we need to love our disciples? Do we need to love our Dharma brothers and sisters in order to succeed in this practice? The answer is yes. Just as the loving presence of the parents is quite crucial for the growth of a baby, the loving presence of a teacher is very important for his or her disciples. The loving presence of our brothers and sisters in the Sangha is very important for us to grow as practitioners. That is the message sent forth by this Bodhisattva. We need love and affection, warmth and nurturance in order to grow and progress on our path. Well, there's other elements I really wanted to get into. This idea of the great physician. You know, Buddha is seen as the great physician or the great healer, using skillful means as described in the Lotus Sutra through the parables. And the medicine king is also like this. So what medicine are you using in your practice? As a bodhisattva, how are you serving others? I work a lot with grieving people who are bereaving lost ones. So the medicine there sometimes is just listening, companioning, just being there. What ointment are you putting on your open wounds or that of another? Medicine can be bitter. But as my mom said, it's good for what ails you. And I'll end with just a short story. And actually, this came when I thought about Roshi's talk last night. My envy ember is burning. Like Roshi's smoking tree story. You know, I think sometimes I just can't, I'm not doing enough. I just can't do enough. Why can't I be like the Dalai Lama or Martin Luther King or Brian Stevenson or Bernie Glassman Roshi or Roshi Gyoku? I want to do so much more. Well, back to Eve, she actually got back into the States, came back to her home, and realized that, let's see, one of the lines says, the apocalypse has arrived. The Kuan Yin statue in their backyard had fallen over. So, as Eve often does, she talks to her dogs, but she also goes out and talks to Kuan Yin in her backyard. So she walked over her and said, "So, you've given up the ghost, eh? What's the matter? Job too tough for you?" "It's the chipmunks," Kuan Yin says. "They're eating me alive." "What about Israel and Gaza, blacks and whites, the people dying of COVID in India? What are we supposed to do about all that while you lie on the ground helpless?" Kuan Yin says, "Leave me alone. Compassion needs a break. Have a good rest, girlfriend, but when you're ready, get back up, I say. Lots of wars out there." "You didn't put me in a war," she said. "You put me in this beautiful backyard. I can't do much for the folks in Gaza or the ones who cling to the boats in the Mediterranean trying to make it to Italy. I can only do what I'm needed to do here. I don't move around much, in case you haven't noticed. Things are so critical in other places. But I'm here, so here is where I work." "What's there to do here, girlfriend?" Kuan Yin says, "Lots of critters need a home, so they come inside me. Now that I've fallen, it's even easier for them. Lots of them need food, so they're chewing up my body. They can't chew up a couple trees. We don't lack for any here," Eve says. "Henry leaves me his toys. Aussie pees on me. I give shade to the daffodils. You're not needed in the Pioneer Valley, Kuan Yin. You're needed along battle lines in the Ukraine and in the girls' schools in Afghanistan." Kuan Yin says, "I'm valuable wherever you put me. I'm valuable standing and lying down. I can do my work in any posture or position. I don't need pictures, postcards of houses blown to smithereens or mothers crying after babies. I've got lots of work right here in your backyard. You hear me, Eve? There's lots to do right in your backyard." What's in your backyard? What medicine can you use to heal yourself? What medicine can you use to heal this saha world? How is your devotion, dedication, and love manifesting?